updated tweaks. Oh, hooray. Here comes the recording. Okay, so without further ado, then I will let Mr. Visser get started. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much today. And it's great to see so many people here. As we were chatting beforehand, gosh, it's been a while since I've had the opportunity to interact with the National Barn Alliance. And it was, gosh, in those years when there were these barn breakfasts at the National Trust conferences that we would go to with Bill Kimball at the helm. And it was always the high point as far as I was concerned of those conferences. So some of you may have some memories to back then. Of course, as we were saying, paths go this way and that way. And hey, under the circumstances, if this new Zoom is a way that we can reconnect, this is absolutely wonderful. So thank you so much for the invitation. And I hope this is just the beginning of future collaborations. What I want to do is I have put together a PowerPoint presentation, and so I thought I would go through that. And I also want to leave as much time as we can at the end for discussion. So if you want to try to keep a list of ideas, questions, recollections, comments, whatever, that we'll cover those at the end in kind of an open forum. So anyway, why don't I skip over to the screen here, and then we can take it from there. Oh, I might as well. Yeah, this is the book. This is a first edition. Anyway, it is what kind of started me kind of from an academic point of view on this. But I've had, as I'll be talking about, a lifelong connection with barns. And I think, just for context, it was shortly after I received my master's degree in historic preservation, and I was hired at the University of Vermont to teach, that I recognized that there was at that time, particularly, only a few books that were really looking at the academic perspective on barns. I mean, there was Tom Hubka's Big House, Little House, Back House Barn was out by then, which was, of course, greatly influential. And there were many, many beautiful picture books, coffee table books, but kind of combining the beautiful pictures with the historical research, there seemed to be a gap. So I applied for a grant. I applied for a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, and I was very fortunate to be awarded that grant, which enabled me to spend a year or two traveling around New England, interviewing barn owners and farming families and so on. And that was the primary means of doing the research, the field research, quite literally, for it. So this is what I'm going to be kind of sharing with you all, just some of the takeaways, if you will, from that experience, without getting into too much of the depth. So with that, why don't I see if I can share the slide here. Okay, so hopefully we're at the on the PowerPoint presentation here, and yeah, let me skip ahead if it will allow me to skip ahead. Yeah, so kind of, shall we say, rural heritage connections. I'm sure many of you here today share such connections with rural places. For myself, it was growing up in rural New Hampshire, and there was that period after college. I was doing contracting work, doing a lot of barn preservation, old house preservation, and it just so happened probably one of the high points was captured in this photo that my father took in the 1970s of me and my friend Lucy. She had a horse. We heard about someone who had a carriage in their old barn, and we worked out a deal. So with some work around the place, he lent us the carriage. The horse we didn't have any knowledge, an older horse. We didn't know that the horse had any experience pulling a carriage, but without too much ado, we trained the horse, and what a summer it was. I'll tell you, we went absolutely everywhere. And the sort of the culmination was this Sandwich Fair parade in October of that year. So anyway, it was, just kind of one of those symbolic experiences of putting this and that together. And I mean, the harness that you see in this picture was hanging from a nail in my father's barn that had been there for, oh, I don't know, 40 or 50 years. So she had the horse, I had the harness. We borrowed the beautiful carriage, and away we went. So anyway, this is the kind of thing. Growing up in a rural area, people know each other, and it's just this kind of opportunities to work together. I really, like I say, I've tried to kind of carry on with some of that feeling and that tradition through the education activities that we've been doing at the University of Vermont since well, I started teaching there in the 1980s. But a major focus has been on rural preservation. Yes, we're covering urban issues and so on, and international issues, but really rural issues are, in my mind, one of those areas where there's much more potential and need. When we look back at the such an important part of America's heritage relates back to that rural experience. From north to south, east to west, uh, it is one of those areas that has perhaps not been studied as much, not has been documented as much. And so I just see, particularly in today's world, we're becoming much more sensitive to diversity and different perspectives that people have in different groups and migrations and hard times and all of that. Let's not forget about our rural heritage. So anyway, I think the barns certainly serve as a symbol of much of that. And if this is a way to connect with people, I think we're, it's a worthy endeavor, I really think. And certainly part of that experience also has been the practical work, collaborating with nonprofit groups, especially to help provide technical assistance. I'm not doing consulting now, but I've certainly passed the baton on to many, many students. I think I just saw one of our students has signed up here. Hello. And so anyway, excuse me. It's really great to see these efforts being pursued by the next generation or so. So, I think, certainly what I've tried to do through the book that I wrote is to examine a method of doing research on rural heritage that focuses on historic contexts, sort of these broad patterns of history. So we're not just looking at objects, but we're looking at the overall, shall we say, flow of history and the context of which times were changing. I mean, the image that I'm showing here is kind of at that cusp of the decline of the sheep boom in Vermont and the transition to dairy. And what made that possible was the arrival of the railroads. But it was also a result of opening up of sheep raising in Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, which had a major impact on prices and for wool, and all of these things come together in these broad historic contexts. Um, but there's also the local history, and I think particularly in rural areas, kind of tapping into those sources of local history takes some work. Yes, there may be a local library, but it really takes work. It could be engaging people with oral history. It could be, looking at the family archives. Local historical societies are often wonderful vehicles for sharing that information. But I think in today's world, we're seeing more and more, of course, online sources and access to periodicals in many, many libraries. I think the periodicals that I found to be most useful and continue to find most useful were those that were published during the mid to second part of the 19th century that were catering to the readership of farm families. So I'm talking about the American agriculturalists, a Genesee farmer, a New England farmer, Maine farmer. These were periodicals that were speaking to rural families. And in there, they talk a lot about barns. And so again, these publications are often more and more online. I did get these old journals through interlibrary loan when I did the research, but now we do have these kind of online resources. So they can be a real treasure trove to dig through. The other incredibly valuable source that I have worked with over the years on this has been what I call pictorial evidence. That is old photographs, and to look at photographs like I'm showing here. And I hope it shows. You see there's that barn, and you see those two black piles in front of the barn. I think everybody knows what's going on here, right? So the photo is taken in the spring of the year. It's Vermont, probably April, March, or early April. There's still some snow. But what that is, those are the piles of manure, right? That were shoveled out all winter long, So anyway, well, okay, this is circa 1860, and we're going to talk about technology change and how one would not see that 10 years later or 20 years later. So again, there is so much evidence. If one really wants to try to dig into some of these older photographs, I encourage you all to keep your eyes open for that as a resource. Historic maps. Here again, these county maps that were so popular during the 1880s, well, 60s, 70s, 80s. What the trick there is that, of course, often there's only one rectangle for the farm, and it's not showing individual rectangles for the footprints of the various outbuildings or barns or whatever. So we can't, we have to understand that. But nevertheless, we'll have a place and we'll have a name, and this can make a huge difference if one actually does want to dig into deed research, which can be enormously time consuming, for any of you who've tried to do that. But still, starting with that information on the maps. And then the next step is the agricultural census records. I don't know if you've all had a chance to dig into those. I haven't found them online yet, but the agriculture, these are federal agricultural census records. Let's see, 18, I think it's 50, 60, 70, 80. I think those were the ones that are still around. I've had to access them on a microfilm. But if you know the name on a county map, and if it's organized by county, or typically are by county, you might be able to find the name, and then what a treasure trove that will be, because it's going to tell how many head of cows, how many pigs, how many chickens, how many workers, how many bushels of this and that. Incredible detailed information on the history of the agricultural production. They don't talk about barns, but they talk about the agricultural endeavor, and one can kind of start to piece that together. So then, of course, the other thing is field research. you know, Quite literally going out in the field. And again, this is for the work that I did researching my barn book. I learned so much from those conversations that I was having in the field. And it's the approach. I mean, you stop, you look like a tourist, maybe have the camera with a smile on your face, and somebody come out and say, can I help you? And I'm interested in your barn. And before you know it, it's a plate of cookies and you're looking at the attic, and it really can happen. And some of the best experiences that I've had were really those kind of endeavors, those informal, not the knock on the door, thank you very much, but still the invitation to come in. And state historic preservation offices for my project, they were incredibly helpful with leads. So they're an amazing resource as well. So anyway, So kind of the approach that I'm kind of talking about here is looking at ways of examining the physical evidence to determine the age of building features. So it could be the age of the barn, or it could be the age of the addition or the alteration to it or whatever. But some of the main clues here include the timber framing techniques. We'll talk about that a little bit. How the joints were made, how it was hewn, saw marks, nail types, and so on. So these changes in technology can be very, very helpful for us, almost as though we are building archaeologists. We're looking at these layers and looking at that evidence. So just kind of a general rule of thumb, and I think for those of you who are not in New England, what I'm hoping here is that some of this information will be transferable. To be sure, as there was that westward expansion, you may find that kind of the story gets picked up in the 1840s, 1860s, whatever. But basically, in New England, because it is going back quite literally to the 1600s, there is this physical record that we can touch base on for the physical evidence. So post and beam frames, hand hewn until around the 1840s. Yeah, sometimes later, depending if it's close to a sawmill, there may be sawn timbers earlier. The mortise and tenon joinery, generally 1870s, 1880s, with the Industrial Revolution and so on, we kind of see that moving towards iron and steel fasteners as we get to the end of the century, and big nails, spikes, and so on. There was a transition from the kind of trial and error method of getting the joinery of timber frames to fit, to using a method that was called the square rule. And this happened around well, in the early 1800s, but by the 1820s, it seemed to be dominant among those timber framers. And I want to, just kind of acknowledge here that timber framers were a specialty trade. I think a lot of people say, oh, it was the carpenter. Well, actually, and to a certain degree, it's still the case today. There are timber framers who have the tools, the knowledge, and they specialize in doing that work. When we look back at the list of passengers on the Mayflower, there were timber framers and there were carpenters. So it's a subtle, yes, they're all working with wood, but there is a special knowledge, if you will, associated with that. So there was this basic shift in the early 1800s, as I say, to using mathematics to describe the size and shape of each part of a timber frame, and making sure that it followed very tight standards. This was the same thing that revolutionized industry. Okay, so this was happening in building framing. Not only barns, but houses as well. So then once we get to the 1850s and later with the manufacturing efforts, we certainly see these heavy sawn timber frames that were dominating, well into the early 20th century. My parents' barn, the place they owned when I was a young kid, that was built in 1912. And sure, it had 2x4s on the lower walls, but the main truss work in the haymow was all of 8x8s, sawn 8x8. So it's kind of this transition, which would be typical. Balloon frames, of course, in houses and sometimes in these barns after the 1870s. And then I'll be showing some examples of what we might call hybrid or reconfigured frames, due to some issues I'll talk about in the 1890s, where there was this kind of reconfiguration of many, many barns, taking old barns, moving them, reshaping them, and so on. And then, of course, by the 1920s, there were the engineered truss frames that are still, we see many of them on the landscape from New England to Pennsylvania to Michigan. I mean, across Iowa, they're across, especially the dairy areas of the country. So again, what I'm trying to say here is that by looking at the physical evidence, we may be able to narrow down the age of a barn I don't know, I try to do a plus or minus 10 years. Typically, so here's just a quick image that I took of a barn. Unfortunately, it has been demolished, but I estimated it to be built around 1850 because the nails were a type B cut nail. It had a square rule frame. It had what we call drop tie beams, and it all had sawn rafters. And again, the type of saw marks helped with that dating too. The transition from vertical sash saw marks to circular saw marks that was happening around 1850s, generally in this area. So again, this kind of evidence can help us. Sometimes we can use architectural styles to estimate the age of a building, but it's pretty rare. I mean, I'm showing a nice example of a French Second Empire style stable, the Morgan Horse Farm down in Weybridge, Vermont. It's absolutely beautiful, high style example. But often we don't, federal barns, Greek revival style, maybe some little hints here and there. But that standard rubric of using architectural styles to date houses just doesn't usually work too well when we're looking at trying to determine the age of barns, or I might add, the significance of barns. Because they're really typically, rarely is style a major factor. Another way that physical evidence can be used, of course, is to determine the uses of barns and spaces within those barns. So here again, on a site visit, to find these wooden stanchions, signifying, yeah, okay, so here was the milking parlor on this dairy barn. It was a small herd, and there's just so much embedded information that one can get out of a visit to a place like that. And by looking carefully at the details, one may be able to get a sense of when it was constructed, how long it was used, and so on, kind of putting on that lens of the archaeologist, if you will. So of course, there's also this very rich kind of interplay, if you will, between tradition and innovation. By tradition, I mean, we do it because that's the way we've always done it. And by innovation, hey, here's a better idea. How about if we do it that way? So there's that tension that's always kind of going back and forth. So the barn raising, as I say, it may very well be that the frame itself was cut by the timber framers, but everybody, and their cousins and uncles and aunts, everybody is invited to the barn raising to lend a hand, and you bet there's going to be a big party afterwards. I mean, again, these are the kind of rural traditions that are so much part of our culture. So I want to kind of step through some of the kind of important examples of New England barns. Again, they kind of came through from my research. I want to start by acknowledging that there are still, at least when I was doing the research, there are still some Acadian barns in that northernmost area of the state of Maine. And it wasn't until the 1840s until the international boundary between what is now Canada and the US was actually fully resolved. And so there are some areas which, while I was there, I heard more French than I heard English. And so to acknowledge this French influence on North American rural architecture in the United States, I think is a good starting place. And again, there was some leads from the Maine State Preservation Office that really helped here to track some of these down. Some of the most vulnerable and threatened resources that are there with regards to a specific, shall we say, property type, to use the wording, the jargon. So. But then, in New England, of course, that sort of that first type of barn, the general purpose barn, is what we have long called an English barn. And I'm going to put it in quotes because in many ways, it stems from the traditions that were brought over by English-speaking settlers to the New World and to what is now the New England states, to a certain degree based on some of the traditions. This is an illustration was actually published in the 1830s, showing what at that time was regarded as an old English grain barn. And of course, the English climate is very different from the New England climate, especially in the winters. But still, this kind of, it's a pitched roof. It had this so-called entry porch on the side. And so some of those traditions were brought through. And one of the oldest documented barns that we know about in New England is in Hingham, Massachusetts, just on the South Shore, south of Boston. It has been, the estimate is that it goes back to around 1693. It's gone through some changes, but what is amazing when I visited there was on the inside, one can look up, can still see some of the framing where there had been an entry porch on it. Again, kind of following that English pattern. It's been extended and so on, but still, the treasures that lie inside these barns, it can always be quite surprising. So then we get what we sometimes is called a 30 by 40, because that was a standard size here. It was the general purpose barn for families that were, I mean, perhaps starting out, shall we say, as homesteading, but on 200 acres, it was subsistence farming. There was especially this great wave of migration into the interior areas of New England after the end of the American Revolutionary War. I mean, my ancestors go back to the, I guess, 1630s or 1640s, and I mean, there was primarily they were close to the coast, but then by the 1790s, there was this huge wave coming up. Western Vermont was coming up from Connecticut, New Hampshire, Maine was coming up from Massachusetts, and then some crossover and so on. So we kind of get these traditions that were brought along, and we still have some survivors, such as this. It was for cows, chickens, pigs, hay. It was that general purpose barn. So this was the outline. My father did this drawing of the barn after my mother died. My stepmother owned this barn, and so we documented it from around 1800, and a purlin and frame barn from New Hampshire. And again, some of the terminology here I've kind of layout, and very, very typical of this kind of first generation of, shall we say, interior New England barns, these English barns. So, but when we look kind of broadly at the New England area, we can see some very obvious differences in the way the barn roofs have traditionally been framed. And it also applies to houses, but you can't usually see the framing of the house because of the plaster and everything else. But basically, on the eastern area of New England, there was that long tradition of having principal rafters and then horizontal purlins connecting them with vertical roof boards, laying from ridge down to the eaves. Whereas in Western New England, basically Connecticut and the Champlain Valley of Vermont and sort of the Berkshires of Massachusetts, it was just a rafter frame roof without the purlins. And yes, there are some exceptions to it, but it was really quite amazing when doing this field research to see this kind of demarcation line that I've tried to sketch out here on that drawing. But what's kind of fun is if we look at this in comparison with spoken dialect. There was a wonderful study done in the 1930s. Hans Kurth was the researcher who did interviews with older residents in not only New England, but in other parts of the country too, to kind of exploring this concept of linguistic geography. And so, I mean, here, for example, what I really love is that line at number 3 is that sort of isogloss, as they call it, that shows that transition of east of that, the word B-A-R-N is pronounced barn, whereas west, it is a barn, right? So maybe the ear could pick up on that. And then there are others, is it 30 or is it 30? I mean, subtle little differences, But to see that corresponding so closely to the way the timber framing was being done was a real eye opener. So I hope this encourages many of you to also keep your eyes open for some of these kind of subtle cultural clues that may link to our history. So by the 1830s, there was a major transformation in the barn, moving away from that English barn that was built on grade to the what is sometimes called at the time the side hill barn or the bank barn. And the whole idea here was to put a cellar onto the barn to protect the manure and as a labor saver. Okay, so for the dairy herd, instead of shoveling it out the a hole in the wall like the slide I showed you in the beginning, hey, let's just pop open that trap door and let it go down into the basement. And not only that, because it is protected through the winter months, then the nutrients in the manure are not going to be leached out into the soil. And if the farmers were really smart, they would park a sledge or a cart or something underneath the drop hole. And what a labor saver to do it all in this one all at once. So this then became the most popular design for these barns, by the 1830s, 1840s. These side hill barns, as they were often called. And a place like Vermont, where there are very few flat areas, it was natural. But we'll certainly see them, and it'd be fun if some of the rest of you have seen those in your travels as well from that period. Another theme that I wanted to explore is the gable front barn, in this case looking to New York State, to a certain degree New Jersey, and yeah, sure, other areas where there were European people, especially people coming from the Netherlands, who brought along their cultural traditions. And I mean, the other part of my family is from the Netherlands, and having traveled there, it's been amazing to see barns like this there still on the Frisian landscape, with their main entry on the gable end. And so this then also provided some practical advantages. So here are some images from the Historic American Building Survey, in this case of a New Jersey example of a so-called Dutch barn. It's called that because inside there are some of the traditional timber framing techniques, this big horizontal anchor beam with these projecting tenons that I've called out here in that barn. But the other advantage of this design, by having the entry on the gable end, is that one could have a long passageway along the length of the barn, and then have the various functions of spaces aligned on the sides. And if one would be prosperous and one wanted to expand the barn, one could just add additional bays. Whereas with the English barn, it doesn't lend itself to expanding as well. So the earliest example, and I'm sure there are some, I've heard of some in Massachusetts, but the earliest example I came across that was documented by the owner was this gable front barn in Rumney, New Hampshire, from around 1810. I mean, he had records on the house from that time. The barn had been moved slightly for the highway, but we had a wonderful afternoon exploring the features of that barn, and everything, the physical evidence all kind of confirmed that 1810 period. So this was early, but soon we start to see that gable front become the dominant shape for the general purpose barns, especially dairy barns, across New England. Quintessential view here of Shikaroa Lake with the gable front barn. The photo was from a collection of negatives that I have from around the 1890s. And then one of the first photographs I ever took as a kid, I borrowed my father's camera and I took this very photograph of this gable front barn. And I was worried that it was going to fall down, and yes, it did fall down within a year. And so these are the kind of, we're talking about connections. And through the research that I did, certainly there were many other examples of buildings that were barely standing, and so I think that was one of my goals for the book, was to really try to document as much as possible before that knowledge was lost. And so again, another trend that came about in the mid 1800s was this movement towards the so-called model barn. This was really promulgated by the agricultural periodical press, if you will. And the whole, hey, I've got a better idea. This concept was really, it really started to spread. And so I mean, things like uh, putting the doors on an iron roller instead of having to deal with the great big hinge doors that would act like a sail, that could be very dangerous on a windy day. If you have dealt with, what this is like. So again, this kind of concept of applying technology to improve the performance of the building. And as I say, much of this was being printed out in these periodicals, and books also started to appear during this period, talking about various ways to improve the design of farm buildings. And it really became quite fashionable to kind of maybe even outdo the neighbor a little bit with this or that improvement. Again, a wonderful source of information as we're doing the research. One of those improvements was the shift away from having barn boards that were widely spaced to putting battens over the seams. The whole theory was, well, if the cows are warmer through the winter, we won't have to feed them as much. Therefore, for the same amount of acreage, the same amount of feed, we can get more milk, or we can add another cow, or whatever. Nevertheless, it was soon discovered that there were some issues with that. But another sort of step along the way, as I say, was the so-called gravity flow barn. So it wasn't just the manure basement that we saw with the side hill barn, but it was also this idea of putting the hayloft on the top floor, putting the stables on the middle floor, and putting the manure basement down below. So again, gravity flow, labor reduction, and so on. Nevertheless, by the 1850s, 1860s, some of those people who really got into it, maybe they had shingled their barns, maybe they made a really tight barn, as it was known. They started to recognize there could be some problems. And the problems, of course, had to do with condensation. Not only that, but the fumes from the manure, especially the fumes from the urine, the eye-watering fumes. You can imagine what it'll be like in the winter months, especially in a very tight barn with a herd of cows in there. And so something had to be done. So this is what then led to the adoption of ventilators. So these would be, louvered ventilators on the roof, but would come down with a shaft, typically a wooden shaft, that would go right to the stable area, so that the noxious fumes could be exhausted and fresh air could come in. Nevertheless, not having the icy winds blowing through the barn. So, by the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, again, the cupola became a statement of style, fashion, or whatever. In this case, it was kind of curious. For this barn, the style of the cupola matches the Queen Anne style of the house. The barn didn't, but the cupola did. So it's kind of touching on some of these themes. And of course, the beautiful brass weather vanes and all of these became part of the culture. So then by the 20s, 1930s, of course, once the people started to recognize that those cupolas would take an awful lot of work, and who wants to crawl up there to do the repainting and so on and so forth. So there were a number of manufacturing companies. One of the most prominent, including across New England, we see them all over, are the steel ventilators that were manufactured by the Loudon Machinery Factory of Fairfield, Iowa. And I'm sure many of you have seen these in many, many other areas across the country as well. So we really get into kind of this more uniform designs by the 20th century. Another issue was transferring the hay into the haymow. Well, okay, during the 1860s, somebody had a better idea. Let's do a great big hay fork. Let's scoop that up with some ropes on a pulley, get the horse to pull it up, and what a labor saver this was. So then, of course, by the 1880s, we start to see these big so-called high drive barns across Vermont in other areas as well. But these really became a very important. Larger herds, where maybe 30 milk cows. Here's one from 1884. When I talked to the owner, I said, well, what do you call those high drive, the little gable thing? Well, he said, that's waffin. Waffin? Yeah, it's waffin. Okay. So that's what they're locally called in northwestern Vermont. And that was fun. And of course, this is also a time, especially in the early 20th century, we start to see the round barns, so-called. And whether they're 12-sided, 10-sided, 8-sided, whatever, these then also became kind of one of these stylistic, if you will, examples of progressive farming. Nevertheless, something came along very soon. There was this expansion, of course, of the summer estate farm, and this really was a way to promote many of these model farm ideas. I mean, a virtual village. This was all one family that I'm showing here in Cavendish, Vermont. The 1790s house, the 1890s mansion, and in the 1880s cow barns and piggery and chicken coop and so on. So what happened? Okay, disease. In this case, tuberculosis. All right, and I think many of you are familiar with this. It touched families everywhere. And in this case, just one example, 1896, a herd of 96 cattle uh, were diagnosed with tuberculosis. 77 of them were immediately slaughtered. By that time, the swine were all found evidence to have the disease, and they were also all killed. I mean, talk about a travesty. Talk about the family fortunes literally being buried in the ground. This hit so many people, so hard. And of course, bovine tuberculosis, is also transferable, is communicable to people through the milk, through the droppings, the dust, and so on. So what that did is, as this became understood by the early 20th century, suddenly the technology of this gravity flow barn with the wooden cow stables and so on, that became outmoded. Something had to be done to reduce the spread of disease, especially if the dairy farmers wanted to sell their milk. So it was the milk sheds that said, the big ones, Boston area, whatever, that said, hey, we're not going to accept your milk if you've got a wooden floor in your stable. We're going to send our inspectors up there. So the solution, if you will, was the ground level stable barn. So the whole idea was to bring the stables down to the ground level, use concrete for flooring material, keep it wet, so that you don't get the dust, as a way to reduce the transmission of the tuberculosis bacteria. So then that led to this form that I'm sure you'll see. Again, it became the dominant form, the ground level stable barn in dairy farming areas across the country, many areas, of course, by the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and so on. A very nice example. This happened to be owned by the University of Vermont. It was used for dairy, or for Jersey cows. Too short for Holstein, I was told at the time, but great Jersey milk for cheese and so on. But anyway, concrete floor, mechanical gutter cleaner. Flip the switch, that electric motor cleans the gutters, out it goes. And the tractor pulls it away, and the manure spreader is, it's on the fields. So again, this became that transition of technology during that period. And then I talked about the engineered truss frames, also getting rid of those beams and crossbars and so on, to have this design became very common. So this then became the quintessential dairy barn from the 1930s, 40s, and so on. So then what happened? Once again, we had this whole issue with, what about the older barns? So here's an example from early 20th century where 3 English barns were moved around and transformed into a ground level stable barn. Maybe you can see the windows kind of in the back there. Putting on these loud ventilators. I mean, and again, it's a 20th century adaptation using the old barns. But then the other thing that came along, of course, in the late 1940s was the development of antibiotics that could treat tuberculosis. And this had a profound impact, not only for humans, but also for animals. And that then led to the development of the freestall barn. A article here from Popular Mechanics talking about, it was kind of bragging about how here's this innovative new design, and the cows don't even need stalls, and the living area needs to be cleaned only once or twice a year. Up to, very different perspective on cleanliness and disease and so on that came about through the development of the pharmaceutical industry after the Second World War. So then we see these types of farm barns being developed in the 50s and 60s. The concrete stave silo, of course, for the feed, and then the sort of a metal a dairy barn. So anyway, those are the high points, and but this is only the beginning, because there are other farm buildings, and I don't know, I'll leave it up to you. How about, can I just do a very quick bump through it, show you some examples?
Please do. I think that would be great.
Okay, all right. So anyway, just representative examples that we also find on the landscape. All right, and these are New England examples. Horse stables. Okay, before the tractors, it was oxen or horses. Oxen first, and then horses. But these could be horse stables for other uses. Granaries. A beautiful example here from the 1700s, again down in Hingham. This is on the Cushing Place, at the Cushing Place.
Right.
Corn cribs with the canted sides, quintessential design. Again, to keep the corn from getting damp and moldy. It's a very practical design. And we'll find those scattered about. Not so many as we used to. Chicken coops. The smaller chicken coop, of course, used to be a very, very common feature for most farm families. The big concern about chickens is, of course, the spread of disease, once again. So often the flocks were kept small. Nevertheless, as efforts were developed to minimize the spread of disease, we started to see larger and larger chicken raising facilities. Piggeries, once again, small one. On the L here, we see a place for doing the cooking of the food, the slaughtering, and so on. And then the boxed pen areas would be in back. The development of silos as a way for feed storage to let the feed ferment. Yes, it's alcohol that's serving as the preservative here. A French technique that was developed, and of course that has become and still is. Maybe the pits or started as pit silos, and then the vertical silos, and now it's more the kind of the bulk silos that we're seeing. And then other areas, depending on Connecticut, Western Massachusetts, tobacco barns, especially for broadleaf, for cigar tobacco. Potato houses, Aroostook County, Maine, for example, and other areas, as well as other areas around the country. You may see these storage places that keep those potatoes good until maybe February or March. And then when the market price goes up, it would be nice to have those. Hop houses, yeah, for growing hops, one of those kind of boom bust crops, really rare. This is one from Maine, Bryant Pond, Maine, but keep your eyes open for those. Cranberries, of course, southern Massachusetts, southeastern Massachusetts, a screen house where the cranberries, after they be picked, would be sorted right there on the bogs. And then in Rhode Island, one of the most important industries, of course, has been the growing of sod and the development of grass seeds and so on. So again, we have collections of buildings associated with that history that are still there. And then greenhouses, large and small, commercial and private. Once again, I consider them to be an agricultural building and so on. So that's where I wanted to go with the various property types. Um, and I'll just say, as far as the strategy here, what I'm recommending is start with identification and documentation if we can, so at least we know what we're talking about or looking at, and then look at ways to assess the conditions and threats. Ideally, develop treatment plans that focus on maintenance, focus on preventive conservation, address those active areas of of deterioration. Stabilize the building first, okay? Try to maintain the significant character defining features, keep its current use if possible, or come up with another use, depending on what those needs are. So here's just, an opportunity, an example. And this was, a project that I worked on. So on the left, you see the before condition. This was a chicken coop, okay, on the verge of collapse. The owner said, I want to save this. What can we do? So we stabilized it. He stabilized it. Contractor came in, stabilized it, waited a few years later, and then you can see the example on the right, what it became. It transformed this place from a rundown, abandoned facility into a very, very desirable property. So anyway, these things are possible. There may be funding, maybe tax incentives. For that case that I just showed you, it was federal investment tax credits that were used. Okay, right now it's 20% on the. But hey, step number one was nominating the property to the National Register of Historic Places. Step number two was submitting the tax credit application, getting it reviewed by the State Preservation Office, and that then was a significant leverage, financial leverage, that enabled that owner to save those barns and perhaps to make money out of it. So again, it has to be income producing. Gifts, of course, grants as well. Much of the granting today is for technical assistance. So many nonprofit organizations, statewide nonprofits, in some areas, some of them do have technical assistance barn grants. So that would be something to keep in mind. And I just thrown up a few logos and screenshots from a number of organizations around the area that I know of that have been very active in working to preserve barns and advocating and so on. So with that, thank you very much. And I turn the floor back to you all. I'm looking forward to questions, recollections, comments, and so on.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Visser. That was wonderful. And I'm impressed that you were able to throw all of that in to just the limited time we gave you. So that in and of itself, people who know me know I talk too much. So I'm going to take some notes. But if anybody has any questions again, or some other things on your mind, please feel free to throw them into the comment section. I know I had a couple along the way, so I'm happy to get it started here. I noticed that you rely a lot on form in terminology, and so I was and I have always had a thing with that as well, because I felt like form is more consistent than use, because things change so much on farms. So yes, I mean, it's often very helpful, like I was noting for your piggeries, I suppose, to jump to certain labels at different times. But what do you think, so on going back and forth between form and use, or when it matters and when it's not as critical?
Yeah, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head, because let's face it, there's so many examples of how the uses change for agricultural endeavors. So yeah, I mean, form is the safest starting place on this, and then as we can kind of find evidence of it, sometimes it's, wow, what was that used for? Is it a granary, or was it a tool shed, or how many windows does it have? I mean, sometimes it's pretty difficult until we get inside, and we may not be able to get inside. But at least if we can describe that form, that is a really good way, particularly when inventories are being done. I mean, we launched a statewide barn census here in Vermont with our graduate students a number of years ago. That's been picked up by the State Historic Preservation Office. Volunteer relying on volunteer activities. But, again, to sort of lay out some of the basics there. And so I think exactly to at least get the form right so people don't get befuddled by what it might have been used for at one point or another.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up that Vermont, the barn census. New England in general, I think a number of your states have done very well at using and leveraging volunteer labor in order to document barns throughout the state. So Vermont started then from student work. And how did that grow exactly?
Well, it was great. I mean, we were very fortunate that we got some funding that actually was a bit of a pass through from the federal government to the State Historic Preservation Office, and then we did an initial kind of target survey. We kind of teased out some different approaches there with our graduate students, and then we passed that on to the state. The state came up with some funding, and then they expanded it greatly, and so now they've developed a database on it, and as always, it's kind of looking for the next opportunity for funding to continue the growth of it. But at least it's serving as an important a reference source, as well as a means for generating public interest and public support. It's kind of the two work together.
For sure. Yeah, because I know Connecticut's also started as a volunteer thing and then became, volunteer submit your forms, and then slowly but surely with various funding sources, now they have more than 8,000 barns documented in the state. So um, success builds upon success, perhaps. That's a good way to look at that. Like I said, for other larger states, we've certainly talked about that. I know in different places where I've worked, and how challenging it is to collect that data and have enough. And I know Mr. Bays has dealt with it in Oklahoma as well. So excellent. One of the other things I thought I would mention, coming from, or I had been, it's been many more years than what I'd like to admit since I've been a student in grant and preservation. But I will say the available resources for making that historic context when you are, or what you feel is starting from scratch, when there isn't a real, a place to dive in, because agriculture historically is so big. It's our largest industry. So any tips that you have for cutting through, I guess I was thinking about how many periodicals I spent my time looking at, and what actually made it to my context. Anyway.
I think kind of focusing on shall we say, the kind of the formal, if you will, bureaucratic way that preservation planning is being done in many states. We have seen an enormous amount of leadership in this area coming from state historic preservation offices in their development of their state historic preservation plans. Now, in exchange for getting some federal support, each state is required to develop and to update its statewide preservation plan. And I think, certainly Vermont took a bold amount of leadership on that, to say that understanding that historic context of agricultural buildings was so important to the history of the state, as well as to the current economy, the tourist-based economy. So I think this is an opportunity, if you will, to engage with, shall we say, the professional preservation planners, to if it hasn't been done, to do it that way. So anyway, that's just it's kind of a vehicle. I mean, as far as sources are concerned, as I say, I mean, I try to give that long list because there are just, it's just there's so many potential sources. But I'm sure the rest of you today too. It's you start online, and particularly newspapers. As more and more older
Right.
newspapers are coming online, put in some keywords and see what you find. That's what I would
Right.
advise.
And I do think that state historic preservation offices are more open to, because I knew in Kentucky, our National Register coordinator had always said too, that just because it's common doesn't mean it's not significant. That actually, in fact, the more common things are part of the broader trends that are more important. Whereas the one dude who tried cotton farming and didn't last, well, so yeah, and I will second your part about newspapers as well. I think finding advertisements is very helpful, and isolating particularly construction features or technologies that are really apparent, I think are helpful. At least has been somewhat helpful for some of the things that I've worked on too. But it can get overwhelming. So to all the students out there who are still trying, I think you're right. Just to document in as much detail as you can is really our best hope. And then, before we possibly lose some more. If anyone else has any other comments, I know I shared that Ancestry does have the ability. You can now search the non-population schedules for some states to pull up individual ag census records, which I also agree are amazing. And then Brad Bays had posted the link to the historical agricultural census summaries through Cornell, and Cornell's library has done a lot to scan. I think we have that. The Barn Alliance has a list of resources, and unfortunately, I know I put those at the very end, the other links to broader categories, but Cornell's been doing so much to scan those bulletins, which I found very helpful too. Yeah, any other questions popping up from the group? Feel free to unmute and join in the conversation if you want to throw one.
Thomas, this is Greg. You showed the 1790 Castleton area barn that was built circa 1790. If you look at the one end wall, it looks like there's a drop tie on that one end wall, which may imply that there was a one bay addition to the 3-bay original. Can you comment on that?
That may be the case, and I don't have any more specifics on it than just the photograph on that one.
Well, I just noticed that end wall, and there must be a severely dropped tie on that end wall, and that end, the area to the one side of the wagon doors is extremely long, which may imply that there was a one bay addition, which would
what I have seen though on a number of these is that they were asymmetrical, and that the sort of the Haymow area was sometimes quite a bit larger, but it may very well have been an additional bay for that.
Well, I'm just wondering about this asymmetry, like you just said, that it was severely asymmetrical.
Yeah.
Which may imply the addition.
Really good catch. Good catch there. Yeah. This is the subtlety. These are the subtleties we want to keep our eyes open for. I'll give you credit for that. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I've been working with Douglas Reed to talk about the differences in notching techniques in log structures, and also playing along with other elements of it. But you're exactly right, and things change so much by locality, by regions, by subtle lines of cultural influence that we didn't know existed until you find clear evidence through something else that you hadn't considered before. So anyone else?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to
Mr.
say,
Bowman.
particularly with that early 20th century kind of transformation to the ground level stable barns using older barns. I mean, wow. I mean, you're just seeing, sash sawn lumber from the 1820s next to nailed onto a circular sawn, a 2x4 from 1920, 100 years apart, but they were using recycled materials. So that can become an interesting challenge to decipher sometimes.
Indeed. And yes, the farming tradition of just relocating buildings and reusing all the time, that core dedication to recycling and finding a new way and a new purpose confuses all of us, but gives us room. I always say the learning curve in preservation is pretty steep. You gotta put on your climbing shoes. Well, anybody else? I'll give a last minute here opportunity, and then we'll let Mr. Visser go. I will give a plug for people who didn't get on soon enough. Back in 2016, if you were paying attention to the Barn Alliance, we sent a letter to the the Postal Service and their advisory committee to recommend a barn stamp, and it took a little bit of time. But Mr. Visser was very helpful to the consultant company that came up with the barn postcard stamp series. Yes. And we're certainly looking forward to bringing back the postcard and making that something to brighten people's days and promote again the great influence that is agricultural throughout America, and reasons to get out there and keep recording these beautiful barns before they're lost. So thank you, Dr. Visser, again, Thomas Visser, for coming along. And like I said, this will be posted on YouTube, and we'll hope that we'll have many more lectures coming forward to keep connecting us, reconnecting us, and keep the conversation going. We really appreciate your time, and thanks again.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to see so many familiar faces and to reconnect with some people here. And I look forward to continuing these discussions.
It'll be great. Thank you. All right, everybody. Have a great night. See you later.
Thank you.